Welcome to Magnificat TV News, dedicated to offering news of the Church. Today is Wednesday, April 3rd, 2019. The Pope has visited Morocco in an attempt to promote dialogue with moderate Islam. There he has called for freedom of religion, not just freedom of worship. The Pope has published 3 documents to establish the procedures to be followed within the Vatican against those who commit abuse against children. The Archbishop of Cologne, Cardinal Wilkie, has recalled that the Church should not reinvent herself, but to be faithful to Jesus Christ. 1/3 of the churches in Canada will close within the next 10 years. This affects the Catholic churches, the Protestant churches, and even the mosques. The President of Mexico, López Obrador, grandson of Spaniards, has asked the Vatican and Spain to apologize for the conquest and evangelization of Mexico. The Pope has carried out his anticipated trip to Morocco this weekend. He has taken the opportunity to call for true religious freedom, and not only freedom of worship.
The first speech by Francis in his apostolic journey to Morocco was on Saturday afternoon during his meeting with the authorities, diplomats, and representatives of civil society in the country, in a ceremony that took place in the esplanade of the Hassan Mosque.
It is essential, stressed the pontiff, that fanaticism and extremism be countered by solidarity on the part of all believers, grounded in the lofty and shared values that inspire our actions.
Then Pope Francis added, "Faith in God leads us to acknowledge the eminent dignity of every human being, as well as his or her inalienable rights. That is why freedom of conscience and religious freedom, which is not limited to freedom of worship alone, but allows all to live in accordance with their religious convictions, are inseparably linked to human dignity."
That is why he declared the need to move beyond the concept of religious minority in favor of that of citizenship and the recognition of the value of the person, which must be a central place in every legal system.
On Sunday, he met in the Rabat Cathedral with priests, religious brothers, and sisters. Pope Francis emphatically stated that the size of a Christian community is not what gives it the measure of its importance, and he dismissed proselytism as a way to growth.
The paths of mission are not those of proselytism, which always leads into a cul-de-sac, he said, while commenting on the limited presence of the Church in Morocco, but of our way of being with Jesus and with others. Therefore, the problem is not when we are few in number, but when we are insignificant. Salt that has lost the flavor of the gospel, or lamps that no longer shed light.
The Vatican has new regulations to combat pedophilia, which will serve as a reference to the bishops' conferences.
Pope Francis has decided to toughen laws to prevent and combat crimes of child abuse committed by members of the church hierarchy, including people who work in the Vatican.
Included among the measures is the extension of the statute of limitations to 20 years, or the obligation to report to civil authorities if a case becomes known.
The pontiff adds, "Proper pastoral care to victims and their families will be offered, proper spiritual, medical, psychological, and legal support, and the right to a fair and impartial trial."
In addition, the person convicted of abusing a minor or vulnerable person will be removed from their position, but they will be guaranteed a spiritual and psychological rehabilitation. Meanwhile, every effort will be made to restore the reputation of anyone who has been unjustly accused.
Another change is the sanction for those who failed to or delayed reporting cases of the abuse of minors or vulnerable persons, except in the cases of the secret of confession. This law will apply to all Vatican employees, to the Curia, and to the diplomatic staff in the nunciatures.
In order to survive, the Church must not reinvent herself, but be faithful to Jesus Christ, stated Cardinal Wilkie, Archbishop of Cologne.
The Cardinal and Archbishop of Cologne, Monsignor Wilkie, has recognized that the fact that many of the faithful are asking for a change in the moral teaching of the Church is a result of the failure to preach it well. And he also warns that, despite pressure from society and the media, the Church cannot change her teachings and contradict the gospel.
The Cardinal, referring to the German Church, maintains that even though it is valued for its contribution to the cultural tradition of the country, or as an employer, knowing that hundreds of thousands of Germans are employed by the diocese, it is shocking and shameful that fewer and fewer people want to hear the message of salvation. They do not ask for the sacraments. They consider the gospel as something pious, and the creed as poetry.
The task of the Church is to discern spirits, one from the other. It doesn't matter how great media pressure and public expectations may be. They cannot shy away with changes in the teachings if they contradict the spirit of the gospel.
The argument that the vote with the feet, that the departure of people from the Church simply leaves no other choice, does not convince me. Christ himself, with his proclamation, not only sparked approval and rejoicing, but also misunderstanding and rejection. As a result, he did not adapt his doctrine to the people's wishes, but rather accepted the truth that many of his disciples withdrew and no longer walked with him.
Those who are pushing so hard both inside and outside the Church for changes concerning some issues, such as abolishing celibacy, reassessing homosexuality, ordaining women, and accepting extramarital sexuality in general, must respond to these questions. Why don't Protestant Christians in Germany who have all this fare any better? They don't have as many pastors, they do not have more people practicing the faith, or hold up better with regard to the number of those who leave the faith.
In the next 10 years, 1/3 of all the churches of all the religions in Canada will close their doors.
According to National Trust for Canada, a nonprofit NGO dedicated to preserving historic buildings in that country, around 9,000 religious churches could disappear in the next decade due to the lack of religious practice.
1 out of every 3 centers of religious worship, which includes churches, synagogues, and mosques, could lose such status over the next 10 years.
The spokesman for National Trust for Canada, Robert Pajot, has said that although they have observed a trend of the closing of places of worship for some time, the pace seems to be accelerating now.
Pajot attributes this phenomenon to the growing secularization of the Canadian society, which means that fewer and fewer people attend religious services. The fate of many of these centers of worship could be their sale or rental for activities that have nothing to do with religion.
The fact is that if all of the properties are added up, religious institutions rank second as owners of real estate in Canada, surpassed only by the state with its public buildings.
The President of Mexico, López Obrador, has asked the King of Spain and Pope Francis to apologize for the conquest and evangelization of Mexico.
According to the Mexican president, what happened was not a meeting of two cultures, but rather it was an invasion, with acts of authoritarianism, of subjugation, in which one culture was imposed upon another, in such a way that Catholic churches were built on top of the temples of the pre-Hispanic peoples.
The Spanish government has deeply regretted the publication of López Obrador's letter to King Philip VI. It has forcefully rejected the content of the letter. The government considered that the arrival 500 years ago of the Spaniards to the current Mexican lands cannot be judged in light of contemporary consideration.
The Vatican, in turn, has called that St. John Paul II already asked for forgiveness upon entering the new millennium for the sins committed by Catholics in the 2 preceding millennia.
A deputy of López Obrador's party has gone as far as to say that the Spanish people are the cruelest race that has existed in the history of humanity.
Our editorial this week is dedicated to commenting on the Pope's document on pedophilia and his visit to Morocco.
Con un pie ya casi en el avión, porque va a hacer el Santo Padre un viaje a Marruecos este fin de semana, ha firmado el esperado motu proprio sobre la lucha contra la pederastia dentro del personal de la Iglesia, no solamente los sacerdotes, sino obispos, incluso nuncios y también empleados laicos. Esto afecta solo a la administración central de la Iglesia, Ciudad del Vaticano, nunciaturas, pero quiere ser un modelo en el que beban, en el que se reflejen las normas que tendrán que aplicar ahora las diferentes conferencias episcopales. Es, ante todo, creo yo, un documento que busca poner fin a este desastre, a esta plaga, que aunque sea minoritaria, es terrible, de abusos a menores por parte de personas, como digo, relacionadas con la jerarquía de la Iglesia o con la estructura de la Iglesia. Tiene algunas características que le hacen diferente a las normas que ya existían. Por ejemplo, a partir de ahora no caducarán los delitos 4 años después de que el menor cumpla los 18 años, sino que caducarán 20 años más tarde. Además, se establece la obligatoriedad de denunciar cuando alguna persona de la jerarquía de la Iglesia se entera de que existe un delito de abuso a menores, obligatoriedad de denunciar, excepto cuando se ha enterado a través del secreto de confesión. Se garantiza un juicio justo al que denuncia y al denunciado. Se garantiza la ayuda psicológica y, si hace falta, económica a la víctima cuando ha sido considerado como tal por el juez, y también se garantiza la ayuda psicológica al culpable. Porque, lo mismo que en cualquier legislación sobre cualquier otro tipo de delito, no se trata solamente de castigar para prevenir o para meter miedo, sino también de intentar reinsertar, ayudar al que ha sido culpable para que no lo vuelva a hacer, para que ese delito, en este caso el abuso de menores, no vuelvan a ocurrir. Además de esto, yo creo que hay un dato importante, y es que se dice que el que sea declarado inocente, pues se va a intentar devolverle, no se sabe cómo, pero se va a intentar devolverle el honor perdido de parte en ese momento de la acusación. Bien, yo creo que son medidas que buscan, repito, frenar esto y también hacer justicia hacia las víctimas. Quizá, esto es importante y es muy importante, pero quizá si no se va a la raíz del problema, quizá será insuficiente. ¿A qué me refiero? Cada vez hay, afortunadamente, menos casos de abusos a menores por parte de personal de la Iglesia, sacerdotes, religiosos, obispos. Cada vez hay menos casos, es verdad. Es decir, esto, gracias a Dios, fue una plaga que, aunque minoritaria, tuvo en determinadas diócesis un número grande de personas, pero que esto va disminuyendo. Pero hay que darse cuenta de que cuando esto tuvo más éxito, cuando hubo, por desgracia, más casos de abusos a menores, fue en esos años posteriores al Concilio Vaticano II, cuando se hace una aplicación errónea de los documentos del concilio y se produce una relajación moral dentro de los miembros del clero. Por lo tanto, no basta con medidas que garanticen la justicia o medidas disuasorias mediante el establecimiento de castigos. No es suficiente, hay que ir a la raíz. Y la raíz es la relajación moral. Cuando los sacerdotes, habrá excepciones, las hay, pero cuando los sacerdotes han abandonado su vida de oración, su relación con el Señor, su ascética personal, entonces es más fácil que algunos de ellos, aunque sean pocos, pero han existido por desgracia, algunos de ellos hayan caído en este delito, pecado de abusar de los menores. Hay que ir a la raíz del problema, que es la relajación moral. Bueno, esto con respecto a este importante documento que, repito, ahora tiene que ser multiplicado, adaptado a las circunstancias en las diferentes conferencias episcopales del mundo. He comentado que el Papa está a punto de emprender un viaje más, en este caso a otro país musulmán, después del que hizo a Qatar hace apenas unas semanas. En este caso va a visitar Marruecos. Marruecos, un país del norte de África. Marruecos no tiene nada que ver con, por ejemplo, Arabia Saudita en lo referente al trato hacia los cristianos. En Marruecos hay iglesias, en Marruecos los cristianos pueden ir a misa, pero eso no significa que haya verdadera libertad religiosa. No hay que confundir la libertad de culto con la libertad religiosa. En Marruecos no está perseguido por ley el que una persona un musulmán se haga cristiano, pero sí está perseguido por ley con penas de hasta 3 años que alguien intente evangelizar, por ejemplo, dar una Biblia. En Marruecos, según los estudios, hay 8.000 conversos desde el Islam que viven escondidos porque tienen miedo. Hay casos muy notorios que han sido ya publicados de que han tenido que ser bautizados, por ejemplo, en la bañera de su casa para evitar la persecución. Es decir, todavía falta mucho. Hay que dialogar. El diálogo es estupendo. Con el Islam tenemos además algunas cosas en común en el campo dogmático, por ejemplo, la fe en Dios, en el Dios creador y en el Dios misericordioso, y también en el campo moral, el concepto de familia, la defensa de la vida y del no nacido. Hay que dialogar y trabajar juntos en todo aquello que podemos trabajar juntos, pero no hay que ser ingenuos en ese diálogo. Hay que poner un horizonte, hay que tener una meta, y la meta es la de la reciprocidad. Si un musulmán un cristiano se puede convertir al Islam en Francia, en España, en Alemania, ¿por qué no se puede convertir un musulmán al cristianismo en Marruecos, en Arabia Saudita o en Turquía sin que le pase nada? Es decir, el diálogo es muy bueno cuando se entiende como pasos que se van dando, pasos progresivos hacia la meta justa. Si no hay reciprocidad, y si no buscamos la reciprocidad, el diálogo puede convertirse en una excusa, en una especie de pantalla que camufle los problemas verdaderos. Recemos por el Santo Padre para este viaje al Islam, este diálogo nuevo con el Islam, y recemos para que esa reciprocidad se produzca. Hasta la semana que viene, si Dios quiere.
If you wish to stay up to date with what is happening in the Catholic Church, you can do so online at www.catolicosonline.org. Until next time, God willing.